Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, it was fascinating to hear about the Beatles and Mal and their entourage meeting Elvis Presley. I've always liked Elvis and his music since I was a kid, just like I have the Beatles. To have them meet each other was special. Elvis had inspired the Beatles to rock and roll music, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm also glad that Mal got to meet his idol, and I bet he felt like he was in a dream. The dream of that meeting ended with a nightmare at the Hollywood Bowl. When they did their shows there, Beatlemania was out of control, and the fans were unreal. You would think that they would just be glad to see and hear them play instead of screaming, fainting, and getting hurt trying to climb barriers. And then one fan threw a metal fold-up chair on stage, and that's crazy. And I can see now why the Beatles didn't want to tour anymore. I felt bad that Mal's book didn't get any takers. He had a great idea of being around the Beatles and telling this story from his viewpoint. So let's see what's going on today. After the tour, for the next few weeks, they relaxed and stayed out of the limelight, except for Ringo and his wife Maureen. They had a baby boy named Zach Starr on September 13th, 1965. On October 9th, John had his 25th birthday. Mal, Neil, and the whole crew reunited for a party celebrating the opening of Lionel Bart's musical Twang. Then they went back to work with George Martin at Abbey Road. The label wanted material for the Beatles' new LP in advance of the holiday season, and there was no time to spare. Martin said coming to the studio was a refuge for them. It was the time and place when nobody could get at them. The strange hours for their sessions were really necessary because of their busy lives that they were forced into. Looking over the year, they had tours here and overseas, TV, radio, press, and general promotion. Recording was important, but it had to be squeezed in between everything else. And they enjoyed recording much more than touring. They got fed up with the vulnerability of all the continual pawing and needed to escape from time to time. Mal was busier than ever during the production of the new album, which they were to name Rubber Soul. It was a play on the rubber-soled shoes. Paul had come up with it to reflect the admitted inauthenticity of the English R&B or plastic soul. The Beatles' instruments were becoming more diverse by the day. George had started playing the sitar, and Paul had begun using a full-bodied Rickenbacker bass in the studio. It required Mal to expand his relationships with the London instrument vendors in order to maintain easy access to spare parts and enhancements. The band's gear had taken a beating in the U.S., and they got a much welcome gift from Vox that November. Beat International reported that Vox had just delivered a new set of amps to the Beatles. The old ones were still functioning perfectly, but their cases had received so many knocks on their travels that they had begun to look shabby. Mal got a few knocks too during a late-night session at EMI Studios. Beatlemania wasn't just in the U.S., and Mal remembered they were recording in No. 2 studio when a crowd of girls tried to break in through the double soundproof doors leading to outside. Mal said, "I thought I could get them out if I talked to them, so with security holding the inner door, I slipped into the small room between the doors." Of course, with both doors locked, it was a pitch black, so there I was fighting for survival as they jumped all over me, literally tearing the shirt off my back. It's the last time I did that, I could tell you. In late October, the Beatles took a break from the Rubber Soul sessions to attend a ceremony at, of all places, Buckingham Palace. Queen Elizabeth II had announced that the band would be awarded the MBE for Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for service to the nation, marking the first time that pop stars would receive an accolade that was usually reserved for military veterans and the like. In advance of the Queen's investiture of their medals, the boys gathered at Mal and Neil's flat, which was swiftly becoming their regular rendezvous point, and it was at the site of a recent photo session with photographer Leslie Bryce. It had even emerged as a kind of a makeshift storage unit for the bandmates. John Fanning recalled visiting the Montague Mews West flat and coming upon, to his astonishment, a cupboard that was ankle-deep in gold records. After relaxing at Mal and Neil's place, the boys were driven by John's chauffeur, Les Anthony, to the palace and the Beatles' shiny Rolls-Royce Phantom 5. Officially, the group was being recognized for their contributions to British commerce, but beyond their considerable economic achievements during a time when their country was suffering under the dark clouds of a protracted financial crisis, the Fab Four had given the nation bright colors of hope. By the mid-1960s, the group existed in a swirling vortex of new movements of music, art, literature, and fashion. London was the epicenter, and it was the time of the swinging 60s. That same autumn, Mal and Lily learned that she was pregnant with their second child. With Mal away so much, Lily's family had been invaluable to her, and she really bonded with her 15-year-old niece Shan, who stayed with her and Gary in Mosley Hill. Living only a few miles away in Wavertree, Fred and Joan Evans were also regular visitors at Mal and Lily's home on Hillside Road, chipping in whenever they could as Lily's pregnancy progressed. The day after their investiture at Buckingham Palace, the Beatles were back at the studio, and Mal was there too. The length of their sessions had been increasing rapidly, often requiring Mal to be at EMI Studios at all hours of the night, on call for a meal, to restring a guitar, or for virtually any odd job the Beatles imagined. EMI was happy to oblige the group in their creative efforts. George Martin said, "We were given very much carte blanche with Studio 2, but didn't really choke people out, although there were times when pressure was brought to bear and somebody who had the studio booked was told that the Beatles wanted it. I didn't approve of all of this, but sometimes the boys would steamroll people. EMI contributed to this by demanding product, and we were often unfairly accused of being arrogant." George Martin was under pressure to bring Rubber Soul to completion in time for an early December release date. As with help, the Beatles were expanding their musical plate. John had the song In My Life, and George Martin overdubbed a Baroque piano solo. Mal later remarked that, "I love In My Life. It's my all-time favorite. Something magical about it." November 11th, the Beatles spent 15 hours in the studio. They were working at breakneck speed in order to finish the album by the deadline. It was on this day that Mal was invited to participate in the magic making for the very first time. As the group completed work on You Won't See Me, Paul got the idea of including a Hammond organ overdub at the tail end of the song. At Paul's instruction, Mal depressed an organ key for the last several measures of You Won't See Me. The boys had fun compiling the LP's liner notes, which cheekily included a credit for Mal Organ Evans. Stress was mounting because of the deadline during the Rubber Soul sessions. Mal said things got tense, and sometimes even between close friends. And recording is not the easiest thing in the world, you know, especially when you got 4 people with different ideas, and you got to gel them all together in one direction. Mal, to a certain level, felt that he was mothering the band. He said, "I was always making tea, sandwiches, or scrambled eggs, just doing anything to look after them, to make sure we kept them working well. The whole thing was, you make the music, and I'll do anything in the world to make you comfortable." He had a second role, too. He became their common enemy when the group was snapping at each other. Mal remembered walking into the control room one night, and the air was electric. You could cut it with a knife, and everyone was snarling, and I just walked in and dropped the tray of cups, and they all turned around and said, "Hey, look at the dummy." For Mal, this was the moment of success, the instant when the boys had a common enemy. They had gotten diverted, and so I broke the ice. Quite suddenly, they were all joking and laughing. Cups were all over the floor, and they went back into the music again. He wrote, "I didn't mind." He added, "While they were laughing at you, they couldn't be shouting at you." A few days after the You Won't See Me session, George Martin and the band put the finishing touches on Rubber Soul, which was set to be released simultaneously with their latest single, We Can Work It Out, backed with Day Tripper on the B-side. Mal knew they were going to perform Day Tripper on the upcoming British tour that would begin on December the 3rd in Glasgow. Mal fashioned a bespoke tambourine, removing its outer skin, inserting an internal rod, outfitting the instrument with an additional ching ring, and attaching the tambourine to a cymbal stand. While Mal and the Beatles made their way north to Scotland, Rubber Soul was released to universal acclaim. It was singled out by many music critics as a clear elevation of the band's sound and creativity. Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys took special note of Mal's contributions to You Won't See Me, writing, "There's an organ drone in there, a note that's held down for the last third of the song or so. Those were the touches they were playing, almost art music." By December the 3rd, Mal made final preparations on stage, and the Beatles had already decided privately with Brian and among their innermost circle that this would be the final tour of their homeland. Ringo said by the end of 1965, the touring started to hit everybody. "I remember we had a meeting during which we all talked about how the musicianship was going downhill, never mind the boredom of doing it, going away and hitting all those hotels." Mal had two thoughts about this decision. On one hand, he adored the opportunity to revel in the Beatles' company anytime, but especially on the road, day after day when they shared meals together and behaved, as he later wrote, like a family unit. On the other hand, he also witnessed how seemingly ordinary fans could lose themselves in an instant and become capable of virtually anything, even occasionally violence. It was like the old times for Mal and the Beatles on their 9-day tour. The band and their entourage took to the motorways instead of depending on the air travel that had dominated their touring days of late. They loaded up the Comer van with the group's instruments, with the group's equipment. There were 7 guitars, 2 each for John and Paul, and 3 for George. Mal left for Glasgow a day early, and Alf was driving Neil and the boys piled into an Austin Princess the next day. The chauffeur was responsible for putting 2 additional guitars, a Rickenbacker and a Gretsch Country Gentleman, to the back of the Austin Princess. He was strapping it on the back on the outside of the car. John and George had been using the guitars during the one last pre-tour rehearsal in the previous afternoon at Mal and Neil's flat. Somewhere in the vicinity of Berwick on the Tweed, not far from the border between England and Scotland, disaster struck. Alf realized there was a problem when a lorry driver began flashing his lights, and when Alf brought the Austin Princess to a halt, he found out what the problem was. The truck driver asked him, "Didn't you hear it fall off?" The spare Country Gentleman had fallen off the back of the limo a few miles back, while Alf was driving the Princess through a bumpy patch of road. George was distraught, looking on in disbelief as Alf and Neil gathered up bits of the destroyed guitar along the motorway. "About 13 lorries went over it before our chauffeur could get near it," George recalled. The stray pieces of broken guitar came in handy a few days later. Paul broke one of the machine heads on the Hofner violin bass, and Mal was able to use the spare parts from the ruined Country Gentleman to make the repairs in Liverpool, where the group was set to play the Empire Theatre. And there was tension of a local controversy involving the fate of the Cavern Club. During the post-Beatle years, the Basement Club had been having a steep decline in attendance. An accountant by trade, owner Ray McFall, had been a notoriously lackluster businessman. Things came to a head when the city council required sanitation and drainage improvements to the club, expenses McFall couldn't afford. On the afternoon of the Empire Theatre gig, the Beatles were approached by well-meaning fans who were campaigning to save the Cavern Club from closure. Paul liked the idea of transforming the club into a permanent local attraction, although John felt less charitable, bluntly remarking, "We don't feel we owe the Cavern anything physical." Salvation would come, at least temporarily, in the form of local restaurateur Joey Davy and his partner Jigo Hagen, the father of longtime Cavernite Debbie Jigo Hagen, now Greenberg. With the hometown gig, the Beatles and their entourage had been understandably besieged by ticket requests from friends and family. Prominent among their guests was Ringo's beloved mother Elsie, along with George's parents, Harry and Louise, and his fiancée, Pattie Boyd. Lily was on hand too, supporting her husband and enjoying a rare night out. NIMS Alan Smith had been with the group during the duration of the tour. He noticed the fans' subdued behavior that night at the Empire. Smith wrote, "Even in the pool, I noticed the quietening down of the audience reaction compared with previous concerts. I'm not knocking in any way. I just think the group's fans are getting a bit more sensible lately." There was tons of thunderous applause to compensate for the lowered screaming decibel rate. The jelly beans were still being thrown on stage, and it would mess up the Beatles' gear and required hours of post-concert attention from Mal. At the Newcastle gigs, fans had supplemented the sticky candies with gonks. They were egg-shaped novelty toys adorned with frizzy hair. They were tiny in size, but the gnome-like gonks were capable of leaving a welt on their victims. In Sheffield, a few days after the Empire performance, Paul was struck in the eye by a hard candy, which resulted in his blinking uncontrollably throughout the show. And prior to the gig, Mal surprised John with the gift of an antique banjo. Mal knew that John's late mother, Julia, had played the instrument, and the roadie couldn't pass up the purchase during the recent shopping trip in Chester, even throwing in a copy of the amateur banjo tutor for John's reference. And that is when Mal pointed out the signature George Formby was scrawled on the headstock. Cradling in his arms a banjo that had once belonged to Liverpool vaudevillian legend and one of his and George's most cherished idols, John couldn't believe his good fortune. The tour came to a close with a pair of shows at Cardiff's Capitol Theatre on December 12th. During the break between sets, Mal and the Beatles dined on bangers and mash in their dressing room, and to the roadie's great delight, they watched a Western on television. The final show was louder than the earlier show, and at one point Mal raced into the fray after a fan leapt up on stage and lunged for Paul and George before being restrained by security. When Smith thought about the show, he pronounced maybe prematurely that the crazy Beatlemania is over, certainly. He thought that Beatle fans were now a little bit more sophisticated than Rolling Stone followers. So I will end the video here. In this episode, we saw the Beatles had a few weeks to relax after their American tour, and that Ringo and his wife had a baby son named Zach. After that, they entered the studio with George Martin to start Rubber Soul album. They were under pressure there to get the record completed before the holidays. The Beatles were under pressure, and Mal was there to calm them down and be their punching bag of sorts. He made them settle down and laugh, as well as providing them food and drinks. He even helped Paul on a song, and it was recorded on the Rubber Soul album. Mal and Lily were about to have another child, and then the Beatles privately told Brian and their inner circle that this would be their final tour of their homeland. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. More importantly, I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.